Imagine you're aboard a Federation Starship. The engines are operating normally. The warp core is stable. The ship is traveling through deep space at hundreds of times the speed of light. Then, without warning, the computer reports something impossible. Gravitational distortion detected. The crew checks the sensors. There is no planet, no star, no neutron star, no known source of gravity anywhere nearby. Then the deflector registers something even stranger. Space-time itself is beginning to curve around the ship. A scientist looks at the readings and realizes something terrifying. The Federation may have accidentally created a black hole. It sounds almost impossible, even by Star Trek standards. But here's the strange part. Federation starships already possess almost everything needed to make this question fascinating. They generate enormous amounts of energy. They manipulate gravity. They distort space-time with warp fields. They use matter and antimatter as a power source. And they routinely experiment with technologies that would be completely impossible by today's standards. So could one of those systems fail in exactly the wrong way? Could a Federation starship accidentally create a black hole? And if it did, would the crew have any chance of surviving? First, we need to understand what a black hole really is. A black hole isn't simply an object with extremely powerful gravity. It's a region of space-time where gravity becomes so intense that beyond a certain boundary, the event horizon, nothing can escape. Not matter, not light, nothing traveling outward. The simplest way to create one is to compress enough mass into a sufficiently small region. Our sun, for example, isn't a black hole because its mass is spread across an enormous volume. But if you could somehow compress the entire sun into a sphere only a few kilometers across, its gravity would become strong enough to create an event horizon. And this reveals the first major problem with our Star Trek scenario. A starship contains a tremendous amount of energy. But having enormous energy isn't enough. You also need to concentrate that energy into an incredibly small volume. That's why a normal starship explosion wouldn't automatically produce a black hole. Even a catastrophic matter-antimatter reaction would be far more likely to destroy the ship in a gigantic explosion than collapse it into a singularity. But Federation technology introduces something that makes this much more interesting: warp drive. A Federation starship doesn't simply accelerate through space when it enters warp. It manipulates space-time. The warp drive generates a field around the vessel, creating a region in which space-time itself behaves differently. And that's a remarkable technological achievement, because according to modern physics, gravity isn't simply a force pulling objects together. Gravity is connected to the curvature of space-time. Mass and energy influence that curvature. So when a Federation starship generates a warp field, it's essentially performing an extremely sophisticated manipulation of the fabric of the universe. Normally, the system is controlled. But what happens if it isn't? Imagine an experimental warp configuration. The ship is attempting to achieve greater efficiency. The warp core is producing enormous amounts of energy. The deflector is operating at maximum power. The computer is calculating thousands of variables simultaneously. Then something goes wrong. The warp field becomes unstable. Instead of remaining distributed around the ship, part of the field begins collapsing inward. The ship's computer attempts to compensate. The deflector adjusts. The inertial dampeners struggle to keep the crew alive, and suddenly the ship's sensors detect a gravitational anomaly. At first it's tiny, almost insignificant. Then it starts getting stronger. Now we reach the most obvious suspect, the warp core. Federation starships use matter-antimatter reactions to generate enormous amounts of energy. When matter and antimatter meet, they annihilate and convert their mass into energy. Under normal conditions, that energy is carefully controlled and used to power the ship. But imagine antimatter containment begins to fail while the warp field is active. Matter and antimatter begin interacting in an uncontrolled region. Energy output rises dramatically. the ship's system starts shutting down. The crew expects an explosion, but instead, something stranger happens. The energy isn't dispersing normally. The warp field is concentrating it. The deflector is focusing it, and the surrounding space-time is already being distorted. Now, the problem isn't simply how much energy the ship has, it's where that energy is going. Because if enough mass energy can somehow be concentrated into a sufficiently tiny region, gravitational collapse becomes possible. The Federation would have created something far more dangerous than a reactor failure. It would have created a gravitational singularity. Here's where we need to separate established Star Trek canon from speculation. There is no standard canon rule stating that a Federation warp core can spontaneously turn into a black hole. So we shouldn't claim that this is something that routinely happens. It doesn't. But Star Trek has already demonstrated that advanced civilizations can manipulate singularities. And the Romulans are one of the best examples. Romulan vessels have been associated with artificial quantum singularities as power sources. That's an enormous clue, because it establishes something important within the Star Trek universe. Artificial singularities aren't completely impossible. Advanced technology can create and control extreme gravitational phenomena. So the question isn't really, can Star Trek technology make a singularity? The universe has effectively answered that. The more interesting question is, could Federation technology create one accidentally? And that's where the scenario becomes genuinely frightening. There's another system aboard the ship that deserves attention, the deflector dish. Most people think of it as the giant dish mounted on the front of the Enterprise. But the deflector is far more powerful than a simple sensor. It can manipulate particles, energy, radiation, and fields in the space surrounding the ship. Starfleet vessels have even modified deflectors for experimental purposes. That makes the deflector something like a gigantic piece of advanced physics equipment attached to the front of a starship. Now imagine combining it with an unstable warp field, or a gravitational experiment, or an enormous energy discharge. If the deflector accidentally focuses energy into a tiny region of distorted space-time, it could dramatically amplify whatever gravitational phenomenon is already occurring. And that's when the crew could discover something they never intended to create. There's another technology we rarely think about because Star Trek treats it as completely normal. Artificial gravity. Every day, Federation crews walk through starships without floating around the corridors. The ship maintains a comfortable gravitational environment throughout its interior. To modern humanity, that would be revolutionary. To Starfleet, it's infrastructure. But think about what that means. The Federation already possesses technology capable of manipulating gravitational conditions aboard a starship. Now imagine an experimental system accidentally amplifying that field. The computer attempts to compensate. The warp core continues producing power. The deflector is still active. And the ship's gravitational systems begin interacting with the warp field. One system alone might be harmless, but advanced technology doesn't always fail one component at a time. Sometimes the most dangerous failures occur when several systems begin affecting one another. And now the ship isn't simply experiencing a reactor accident, it's experiencing a space-time accident. Imagine the bridge. The ship is completely silent. Then the tactical officer reports something strange. Gravitational distortion increasing. The captain asks where it's coming from. The answer? Inside the ship. The science officer begins analyzing the readings. The computer starts reporting increasing space-time curvature. Communications begin experiencing strange delays. The stars outside the view screen appear slightly distorted, and then the computer delivers the message nobody wanted to hear. Event horizon formation detected. At that moment, everything changes. Because if an event horizon is forming, the crew isn't dealing with an explosion anymore. They're dealing with a black hole. Would it immediately swallow the ship? Probably not. And this is where black holes are often misunderstood. A black hole isn't a cosmic vacuum cleaner that automatically sucks everything toward it. If you replace the sun with a black hole containing exactly the same mass, Earth wouldn't suddenly fall into it. Earth would continue orbiting almost exactly as before. The real danger is the object's mass, proximity, and gravitational gradient. So a tiny artificial black hole wouldn't necessarily consume the Enterprise instantly. It could initially be incredibly small, but that doesn't make it safe. If the black hole gains mass, its gravitational influence increases. If it's inside the ship, the problem becomes even worse. The crew would be dealing with intense gravitational forces in an enclosed environment. Structures could deform, systems could fail, navigation could become impossible, and eventually, the ship could be torn apart by tidal forces. The Enterprise wouldn't necessarily explode. It could simply be pulled apart by gravity. Their first response would be obvious: shut everything down, deactivate the warp core, collapse the warp field, disable the deflector, cut power to the experimental systems, and get away from the anomaly. But there's a terrifying possibility. What if shutting down the machinery doesn't destroy the singularity? What if the black hole has already formed? Now the crew has to abandon the ship, and that introduces another Star Trek technology, the transporter. If the anomaly remains localized and the transporter is functioning normally, the crew could theoretically beam to another vessel. But extreme space-time distortion could interfere with transporter operations. The transporter relies on incredibly precise manipulation of matter and energy. A severe gravitational anomaly could make that process unreliable, so the crew might have only one option: escape pods, assuming they have enough time. This is perhaps the most terrifying version of the scenario. There might be no giant explosion, no dramatic fireball, no spectacular destruction. Instead, the ship begins disappearing from normal space. The stars outside become increasingly distorted. The clocks aboard the ship begin behaving strangely. Communications become unreliable. Navigation calculations become impossible. The crew realizes they're trapped inside a region where space-time itself is being distorted. And slowly, the gravitational forces become stronger. The ship's structure begins to fail. The corridors twist, systems shut down, and the final moments of the vessel aren't caused by an enemy weapon. They're caused by the laws of physics. So, would this really happen? Probably not during ordinary Federation operations. Starfleet would have enormous safety systems designed to prevent precisely this kind of catastrophic interaction. Warp core containment, emergency shutdown systems, deflector controls, structural integrity fields, inertial dampeners, computer safeguards, and multiple layers of redundancy. For a normal starship to accidentally create a black hole, an enormous number of things would probably have to go wrong simultaneously. But there's one situation where the danger becomes much more believable: experimental technology. And that's exactly what Starfleet loves. New warp configurations, unknown alien technology, experimental propulsion systems, quantum experiments, gravitational research. Every time Starfleet encounters something they don't understand, someone eventually says, "Let's study it." And that's where the danger lies. Because the Federation doesn't merely operate advanced technology. It constantly pushes that technology beyond its original limits. So, could a Federation starship accidentally create a black hole? Based strictly on Star Trek canon, there is no established evidence that a standard Federation warp core can spontaneously create a conventional black hole. So the answer isn't simply yes, but Star Trek has established that Federation technology can manipulate enormous amounts of energy, gravity, and space-time. Other civilizations have even demonstrated artificial singularities. And once you combine those ideas, the scenario becomes theoretically fascinating. A catastrophic interaction between a warp field, matter-antimatter energy, a powerful deflector, and experimental gravitational technology could create conditions unlike anything Starfleet intended. The greatest danger wouldn't necessarily be an enemy fleet. It wouldn't be the Borg. It wouldn't be the Klingons. It wouldn't even be a Romulan warbird. It could be something far smaller. Something created accidentally inside the ship. Something with no engines, no weapons, no consciousness, just gravity, a black hole. And perhaps the most unsettling thought of all is this. A Federation starship isn't merely a spacecraft. It's a flying laboratory capable of manipulating some of the most fundamental forces in the universe. Most of the time, those systems work perfectly. But if enough of them interacted in exactly the wrong way, the Federation wouldn't be exploring the edge of the universe anymore. It would be bringing the edge of the universe inside the ship. So what do you think? Could Starfleet accidentally create a black hole? Or would its technology make that practically impossible? Let me know your theory in the comments. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the darker side of Star Trek technology, subscribe for more stories exploring the science, mysteries, and hidden dangers behind the galaxy's most advanced starships. Because sometimes, the most dangerous thing in the universe isn't something you encounter out there. It's something you accidentally create yourself.